Sometimes the heart breaks not from loss, but from witnessing a love so pure it reminds us what we've forgotten how to feel. On Christmas Eve, when most families gather around warm fires, Helen Miller discovered something that would change everything. She thought she knew about hope. For 10 years, she had lived alone in her mountain cabin, hiding from a world that had taken her family. But that night, behind an old roadside depot, she found a small boy named Alex sorting through trash under a broken Christmas tree. He wasn't lost. He was waiting for his brother, who had promised to come back. As snow began to fall and the temperature dropped, Alex refused to leave their meeting spot. His faith was unshakable, even when Helen's heart told her the truth might be too painful to bear. But what would happen when Helen realized that saving Alex might be the only way to save herself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence of Helen Miller's mountain cabin had become her most faithful companion over the past decade. At 61, she had learned to measure time not by the calendar on her kitchen wall, which she hadn't changed since 2019, but by the rhythm of seasons against her windows and the gradual graying of her auburn hair in the mirror. She rarely bothered to check. Her cabin sat perched on a rocky outcropping 3 miles up Widow's Peak Road, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became impassable during heavy snows. She had chosen this isolation deliberately, the way some people choose medicine, bitter but necessary. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the mountain, close enough for emergencies, but far enough that she could go weeks without seeing another human soul. Each morning began the same way. Helen would wake at dawn, make coffee in the same blue ceramic mug, one of a set of 4 she'd bought when she still believed in company, and stand at her kitchen window watching the sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and amber. The view never failed to remind her why she'd fled here, why she'd chosen beauty over proximity, solitude over the messy complications of human connection. The mantelpiece above her stone fireplace held only 3 items: a small wooden clock that belonged to her late husband Robert, a leather-bound journal where she recorded weather patterns and wildlife sightings, and a silver-framed photograph turned face down. She had placed that photograph face down on the day she moved to the cabin, and in 10 years she had never once been tempted to turn it upright. Some wounds, she had learned, heal better in darkness. Helen had been a high school guidance counselor for 23 years before everything changed. She had spent her professional life helping teenagers navigate the treacherous waters between childhood and adulthood, listening to their fears about college applications and first heartbreaks, teaching them that most problems had solutions if you just knew where to look. She had believed in the power of listening, of gentle questions that helped young people find their own answers. That faith had died on a rainy Tuesday in March 10 years ago. Now her days followed a careful routine designed to fill the hours, without requiring too much thought. Morning coffee and weather observation, a breakfast of oatmeal with local honey she bought from a farmer's market in the nearest town, a 40-minute drive that she made exactly once a month. Then came her morning chores, splitting wood, tending to her small vegetable garden in season, maintaining the solar panels that provided her electricity. Afternoons were for reading. Helen had accumulated an impressive library over the years, ordering books online and having them delivered to the post office in Cedar Falls, the small mountain town that served as her reluctant connection to the outside world. She favored mysteries and biographies, stories about people who overcame impossible odds or solved complex puzzles. Fiction felt too much like hope, and hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her monthly supply runs to Cedar Falls were carefully orchestrated operations. She would make a list the week before, checking and rechecking to ensure she wouldn't need to return before the following month. She shopped at the small grocery store during off-peak hours, exchanging polite nods with the cashier but never lingering for conversation. The hardware store owner, Sam Kowalski, had given up trying to engage her in discussions about the weather or local news. The pharmacist, Mrs. Chen, still smiled and asked how she was doing, but accepted Helen's standard response, "Fine, thank you," without pressing for details. Most residents of Cedar Falls knew Helen Miller as the woman who lives up on Widow's Peak, though few could recall her first name or remember what had brought her to their quiet corner of Colorado. She existed on the periphery of their community, present but not participating, known but not understood. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become exactly the kind of person she used to worry about when she was a counselor: isolated, withdrawn, carrying invisible burdens that grew heavier with each passing year. But recognizing a problem and fixing it were two entirely different skills, and Helen had discovered that she was much better at helping other people than at helping herself. Her cabin was comfortable without being luxurious. Robert had been handy, with tools, and she had learned enough from him to maintain the basic systems that kept her warm and dry. The wood-burning stove provided heat, the solar panels powered her lights and small appliances, and a well-provided clean water. She had internet for ordering supplies and a landline telephone for emergencies, though both went unused for weeks at a time. The walls were lined with bookshelves Robert had built during their first year of marriage, when they had still been planning a different kind of life together. A life that would have included the sound of children's laughter, family dinners around the oak table he had crafted by hand, birthday parties and graduations, and all the messy, wonderful chaos of a house full of love. Instead, the silence pressed against her like a physical presence, broken only by the crackling of fire in winter, the hum of insects in summer, and the occasional call of hawks circling overhead. She had grown so accustomed to quiet that unexpected sounds, a car engine on the distant road, the slam of a door echoing up from the valley, could make her heart race with something that might have been panic or might have been longing. Her reflection in windows and mirrors had become that of a stranger over the years. The woman who looked back at her had weathered skin and lines around her eyes that spoke of too much solitude and not enough laughter. Her hair, once carefully styled for professional settings, hung loose around her shoulders in waves she rarely bothered to tame. She dressed for comfort and practicality: flannel shirts, sturdy jeans, hiking boots that could handle the rocky terrain around her property. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, Helen wondered what her students would think if they could see her now. She had been known for her warmth and accessibility, for the candy dish on her desk, and the way she remembered details about their lives weeks later. Mrs. Miller, they had called her, and they had lined up outside her office during lunch periods to talk about everything from college anxiety to family problems to heartbreak that felt like the end of the world. She had loved that work, loved the privilege of being trusted with young people's fears and dreams. She had believed she was making a difference, one conversation at a time. But believing in your ability to help others was a dangerous thing when the person who needed help most was someone you loved more than your own life. The December afternoon was growing short when Helen realized she was running low on several essential supplies earlier than usual. She had burned through her firewood faster than expected during a cold snap the previous week, and her pantry was looking sparse. The monthly supply run wasn't scheduled for another week, but Colorado mountain weather was unpredictable, and the forecast called for a significant storm system moving in over the weekend. She stood at her kitchen window, watching clouds gather over the distant peaks, and made the decision that would change everything. One extra trip to town wouldn't hurt, and it was better to be prepared than to be caught short if the roads became impassable. She grabbed her keys, pulled on her heavy coat, and headed for the old Ford pickup truck that served as her lifeline. To the outside world, the drive down Widow's Peak Road required her full attention, especially as afternoon shadows lengthened across the narrow curves. But Helen knew every turn and pothole by heart after 10 years of making this journey. She had learned to drive these mountain roads in all kinds of weather, had become skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicated when a curve might be icy or when loose gravel made it dangerous to brake too suddenly. Cedar Falls looked exactly as it always did. A small collection of buildings clustered around Main Street, with mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. The grocery store was nearly empty, which was exactly how Helen preferred it. She moved efficiently through the aisles, checking items off her list, exchanging brief pleasantries with Martha, the evening cashier who had worked there for as long. As Helen had been coming to town, it was on the way home, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, that Helen decided to make a quick stop at the old roadside depot. 4 more days, and I get to see Marcus. Helen watched him burn off nervous energy and realized she was almost as anxious as Alex was. Over the past weeks, Marcus had become real to her in ways that went beyond Alex's stories. She had seen his careful handwriting in the journal entries the police had shared, heard his voice on the recorded evidence he had gathered, and read the letters he had written to Alex but never been able to send. She felt as if she knew him, but she was also acutely aware that their first meeting would determine the future of their unusual family arrangement. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a routine that had become precious to both of them, Alex pulled out his brother's notebook and began reading aloud from entries Marcus had written during his captivity. Day 12, still no word from the outside. The boss is getting suspicious of everyone, making us work longer hours and watching us more closely. I recorded another conversation today about the job they're planning in Nevada. If I can get this information to the police, it might be enough to stop them before they hurt anyone else. I keep thinking about Alex waiting for me at the depot. I hope he's somewhere warm. I hope someone kind is taking care of him. Alex paused, his voice catching slightly. He was thinking about me even when he was in danger. Helen reached over and squeezed his hand. That's what people who love each other do. They think about each other's safety even when they're scared. Alex continued reading. Day 18. I overheard Terry talking about cleaning up loose ends after the Nevada job. I think he means eliminating people who could identify the operation. I'm definitely on that list. If something happens to me, I hope Alex remembers that every choice I made was to try to keep him safe. I hope he finds people who will love him the way he deserves to be loved. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. Even facing potential death, Marcus had been thinking about Alex's need for love and security. There's more, Alex said, flipping to a later entry. This one is from just a few days before they rescued him. He read in a voice that grew stronger with each word. Day 21. I got word somehow that Alex is safe. A guard mentioned that the police had been asking about him and that he was staying with someone who was taking good care of him. I don't know who this person is, but I'm more grateful than I can express. Knowing Alex is safe gives me the courage to keep fighting. If I make it out of this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure he never has to be scared or hungry or alone again. Alex closed the notebook and looked at Helen with shining eyes. He knew you were taking care of me, and it made him braver. Helen felt the weight of that responsibility, not just the legal guardianship, but the knowledge that her care for Alex had somehow sustained Marcus through his darkest moments. It was a connection she had never experienced before, the way love could create bonds between people who had never even met. Over the next few days, Helen found herself preparing for Marcus's visit with the same careful attention she had once given to lesson plans and parent conferences. She researched the visiting facility, learned about the rules and procedures, and tried to imagine what Marcus might need from their first meeting. But it was Alex who provided the most insight into his brother's likely emotional state. Marcus will probably try to apologize for everything, Alex said, as they drove toward the facility on Saturday morning. He'll think it's his fault that I ended up alone, and his fault that he got involved with criminals, and his fault that you had to take responsibility for me. What should I say to him? Helen asked. Alex was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe tell him that taking care of me wasn't a burden, and that you understand why he made the choices he did. Marcus needs to know that people don't think he failed. Helen was struck again by Alex's emotional intelligence. This 10-year-old boy understood his 18-year-old brother's psychology better than most adults understood their peers. The correctional facility was smaller and less intimidating than Helen had feared, but it was still clearly a place where people were held against their will. As they went through the check-in process, Helen could see Alex growing more nervous, his earlier excitement tempered by the reality of where they were. "It's going to be okay," she assured him, as they waited in the visitor's room. "Marcus has been waiting to see you just as much as you've been waiting to see him." When Marcus finally appeared, Helen's first thought was that he looked exactly like Alex had described, tall, dark-haired, with the same intelligent brown eyes. But she could also see the changes that weeks of stress and uncertainty had left on his young face. He was thinner than he should be, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. Alex was out of his chair and across the room before Helen could blink, throwing himself into his brother's arms. With the abandon of someone who had spent 6 weeks believing this moment might never happen, Marcus held him close, and Helen could see his shoulders shaking as he tried to control emotions that were too big for the supervised visiting room. When they finally separated, Marcus looked over Alex's head and met Helen's eyes for the first time. What she saw there was gratitude so profound it took her breath away. "You must be Helen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Helen stood and moved closer, noting how Marcus kept one arm around Alex, as if he was afraid his brother might disappear. "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. Alex has been a joy to have in my home." Marcus studied her face intently, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the stories Alex had obviously shared. "He looks good," he said finally, "healthy and happy. I was so afraid." "He's been safe," Helen interrupted gently. "And he's been brave. And he never stopped believing you would come back." Tears started down Marcus's face then, and Helen realized that this young man had been carrying impossible burdens for far too long. Not just the responsibility of caring for his little brother, but the weight of trying to protect Alex from a world that had failed them both repeatedly. The visit passed too quickly. Filled with Alex's stories about life at the cabin, Marcus's careful questions about Helen's willingness to continue caring for Alex, and the beginning of conversations about what their future might look like. As visiting time ended, Helen could see the anxiety building in both brothers about having to separate again. "Marcus," she said, as the guard signaled that time was up, "I want you to know that Alex isn't just staying with me temporarily. He has a permanent home with me for as long as he needs it, whether that's until you're released or for years to come. You don't have to worry about him anymore." Marcus looked at her with an expression of wonder. "You would do that? Really keep him, even if my legal troubles drag on?" "Marcus, Alex isn't a burden or an obligation," Helen said firmly. "He's become my family, and that means you're my family too. We're going to get through this together." As they prepared to leave, Marcus pulled Helen aside while Alex was gathering his things. "Helen," he said quietly, "Alex told me about your daughter, about how you lost her and came to the mountains to be alone. I need you to know that giving Alex a home when you'd chosen to live without family, that's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for us." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Marcus, taking care of Alex has given me a reason to live again. If anything, I should be thanking you for trusting me with him." Marcus shook his head. "We're going to be okay, aren't we? All three of us?" Helen looked at this young man who had risked his life to gather evidence against criminals, who had endured captivity to protect his little brother, who was facing legal consequences with dignity and hope. Then she looked at Alex, whose faith and resilience had pulled her out of a decade of hiding. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty, "we're going to be more than okay. We're going to be a family." As they drove home that evening, Alex was quieter than usual, processing the complex emotions of seeing Marcus in confinement. But when they pulled into their driveway and looked at the cabin where Helen's old ham radio sat waiting in the window, the radio that had become their link to the outside world during the investigation, Alex smiled. "Marcus is going to love it here," he said simply, "and he's going to love you." Helen looked at the radio that had helped coordinate Marcus's rescue and realized it had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of communication, of reaching out instead of withdrawing, of using whatever tools you had to help the people you loved. Tomorrow would bring more legal proceedings, more paperwork, more steps in the long process of officially becoming a family. But tonight, Helen Miller was no longer a woman hiding from the world. She was someone with people depending on her, someone with a future to plan, someone whose heart was full of hope instead of emptied by loss. And for the first time since Sarah's death, that felt like coming home. 6 weeks after their first visit, Helen was awakened by the telephone at 5 in the morning. This time, however, instead of panic, she felt a surge of anticipation. Sheriff Martinez had warned them that Marcus's release date might be moved up if his community service placement was finalized early. "Ms. Miller." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the tone was warm. "That's beautiful," Helen said softly, refolding the letter and handing it back to Alex. "What happened at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house?" Alex's expression grew troubled. She was nice at first, but after a few weeks, she said Marcus hadn't paid her enough for me to stay that long. She said I had to leave, so I went to the depot because that's what the letter said to do. Helen felt a surge of anger toward this Mrs. Patterson, whoever she was, but kept her voice calm. "How long ago was that?" "A week before I met you," Alex said. "So I've been waiting for 10 days total, but that's okay. Marcus said he might be a little late, and Christmas Eve isn't until tomorrow." Helen's heart clenched as she realized that tomorrow was indeed Christmas Eve. Alex had been counting days, holding on to hope with the precision of a child who had learned to measure time by promises. "Alex," she said gently, "what kind of work did Marcus say he was doing with these men?" "Salvage," Alex repeated the word he had used at the depot. "Collecting things that other people don't want anymore and selling them. Marcus said it was like recycling, but for bigger things. He said the men promised him good money if he helped them for a few weeks." Helen nodded, though something about this explanation continued to make her uneasy. She had lived in rural Colorado long enough to know that salvage operations weren't always legitimate, and the idea of 18-year-old Marcus getting involved with unknown men for quick money raised red flags she couldn't ignore. But for tonight, her priority was making. Sure, Alex felt safe. Tomorrow, she could worry about the larger questions surrounding Marcus's disappearance. "Well," she said, standing to stir the soup again, "regardless of when Marcus gets back, you need a good meal and a warm bed tonight. After dinner, I'll show you the guest room. It has extra blankets and a reading lamp if you'd like to look at any books before you go to sleep." Alex's eyes lit up. "You have books?" "Lots of books," Helen said, gesturing toward the living room where Robert's built-in shelves lined the walls. "You're welcome to choose anything that interests you." For the first time since entering the cabin, Alex seemed to truly relax. He set his mug down and walked over to examine the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines with obvious delight. "These are really nice books," he said reverently. "Marcus would love these. He especially likes the ones about people who go on adventures and help other people. Your brother sounds like a good person to have adventures with," Helen said, ladling soup into bowls. "The best," Alex agreed. He selected a book from the shelf, a collection of short adventure stories, and brought it back to the table. "Do you think it would be okay if I read some of this tonight? I'll be very careful with it." "Of course," Helen said, setting a bowl of soup in front of him along with fresh bread. Books are meant to be read. They're no good sitting on shelves all the time. As Alex ate with the careful appreciation of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted, Helen found herself studying his face and wondering about the life he and Marcus had lived before this moment. The boy had manners, spoke well, and clearly valued education, all signs that someone had taken the time to teach him properly. Despite the hardships they had obviously endured, Marcus had apparently worked hard to give his little brother a foundation of values and hope. "Miss Helen?" Alex said suddenly, looking up from his soup. "Yes? Thank you for letting me stay here, and for making hot chocolate the real way, and for not making me feel bad about waiting for Marcus." Helen felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Alex. Sometimes we all need help, and sometimes we all need to wait for people we love." Alex nodded solemnly, then returned his attention to his soup. As Helen watched him eat, she realized that for the first time in 10 years, her cabin didn't feel empty. The silence that had been her companion had been replaced by the small sounds of another person. The quiet scrape of spoon against bowl, the soft turning of pages as Alex examined his chosen book, the subtle shift of his weight in the wooden chair. It should have made her nervous, this disruption to the routine she had so carefully constructed. Instead, she found it oddly comforting, as if some part of her that had been holding its breath for a decade was finally beginning to exhale. After dinner, Helen showed Alex to the guest room, a small but comfortable space with a window that looked out over the valley. She had rarely used the room in the years since Robert's death, but it was clean and warm, with extra blankets folded at the foot of the bed. "The bathroom is just across the hall," she explained, "and there are towels in the closet if you'd like to shower. I put some clothes on the dresser. They might be a little big, but they're clean and warm." Alex examined the room with wonder, running his hand over the quilt on the bed and peering out the window at the star-filled sky. "I can see so many stars from here," he said softly. "The mountains are good for stargazing," Helen agreed. "No city lights to block the view." "Marcus would love this," Alex said, settling onto the bed with his borrowed book. "He always says the stars remind him that there's so much beauty in the world, even when things seem dark." Helen felt that familiar tightness in her chest at the boy's unshakable faith in his brother. "Alex," she said gently, "what will you do if Marcus doesn't come by Christmas Eve?" Alex looked up from his book with absolute certainty in his young eyes. "He will come," he said simply. "Marcus always keeps his promises. He's never broken one, not ever." Helen wanted to explain that sometimes circumstances beyond our control make it impossible to keep promises, no matter how much we want to. She wanted to prepare him gently for the possibility that Marcus might not be able to return as planned. But looking at Alex's face, so young, so trusting, so completely certain in his brother's love, she couldn't bring herself to plant seeds of doubt. "Well then," she said instead, "we'll make sure you're ready to see him when he arrives." Alex smiled and returned to his book, already settling into the comfortable bed, as if he had been sleeping in safe places his entire life, instead of learning to survive on the margins of other people's worlds. Helen turned off the overhead light, leaving only the small reading lamp glowing beside the bed. "Sleep well, Alex," she said from the doorway. "I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." "Miss Helen?" Alex's voice was soft in the lamplight. "Yes?" "Do you think Marcus will like you?" The question caught Helen off guard. "I hope so," she said honestly. "Do you think he will?" Alex nodded seriously. "He likes people who are kind to me, and he says you can tell a lot about someone by how they treat kids and animals." He paused, then added, "You made me feel safe right away. Marcus will notice that." Helen felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "Thank you, Alex. That means a lot to me." As she closed the door and walked back toward her own room, Helen realized that her carefully ordered life had been fundamentally altered in the space of a few hours. There was a child sleeping in her guest room, a child who trusted her enough to rest peacefully under her roof. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and whether Marcus arrived as promised or not, Helen would no longer be spending it alone. For the first time in 10 years, that thought didn't fill her with dread. Helen woke before dawn on Christmas Eve, her internal clock still running on the schedule she had maintained for 10 years. But as she lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of her cabin settling in the morning cold, she became aware of something different, the soft, even breathing of someone else sleeping nearby. For a moment, she was disoriented, caught between the reality of Alex's presence and the decade of solitude that had become her norm. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, where she started coffee and began preparing breakfast. Through the guest room door, she could hear Alex stirring, and soon the soft sounds of him moving around and getting dressed. When he emerged from the bedroom, his hair was neatly combed, and he was wearing the clothes she had left for him, jeans and a flannel shirt that were indeed too big but clean and warm. "Good morning," she said, pouring orange juice into a glass for him. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied politely. "Thank you for letting me use your shower." "I haven't had a really hot shower in weeks." Helen felt that familiar tug at her heart. "I'm glad you were comfortable. Are you hungry?" As they ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs, toast and fresh fruit, Alex seemed more relaxed than he had the night before, but Helen could sense his growing anticipation. He kept glancing toward the window, watching the sky grow lighter, and she realized he was calculating how many hours remained until Marcus's promised return. "Alex," she said gently, "I was thinking we should go check on your tree this morning. Make sure your note is still there and see if anything has changed." Alex's face brightened immediately. "Can we? I mean, I know Marcus said Christmas Eve, but sometimes people come early when they're excited to see someone." Helen smiled at his optimism. "Of course. And while we're out, we can pick up a few supplies in town. I want to make sure we're prepared, in case the weather turns bad." They drove down to the depot in comfortable companionship, Alex chattering about the book he had read the night before and pointing out landmarks he remembered from his 3 days of waiting. When they arrived at the abandoned building, Helen was relieved to see that his note was still tied securely to the decorated tree, and nothing else had been disturbed. Alex walked around the tree methodically, checking for any signs that Marcus might have been there. He examined footprints in the snow, looked for moved objects, even checked to see if any of the Christmas lights had been adjusted. Helen watched him with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. This child had developed sophisticated survival, skills that no 10-year-old should need. "No sign of him yet," Alex announced, but his tone remained cheerful. "But it's still early. Marcus likes to travel at night, when there's less traffic on the roads." Helen nodded, though privately she was becoming more concerned about Marcus's absence. 5 weeks was a long time for any job, especially one that had taken him away from his little brother. And the fact that Alex had ended up at the depot earlier than planned after being asked to leave his temporary housing suggested that Marcus's timeline had already gone off track. They drove into Cedar Falls, where Helen planned to pick up a few groceries and check on weather forecasts. But as they walked through the small downtown area, Alex suddenly stopped in front of the sheriff's office. "Miss Helen," he said quietly, "do you think we should tell someone about Marcus, just in case he needs help?" The question surprised Helen. In her experience, children from troubled backgrounds often developed a deep mistrust of authority figures, especially law enforcement. But Alex seemed to view the sheriff's office as a potential resource, rather than a threat. "What kind of help do you think he might need?" she asked carefully. Alex's expression grew troubled. "Well, he's been gone longer than he said he would be, and the men he went to work for, I only met them once, but they didn't seem very nice. They talked to Marcus like he wasn't smart, and one of them said something about kids not understanding. Our business works." Helen felt a chill of apprehension. Do you remember anything else about these men? Their names or what kind of vehicles they drove? The boss man was called Terry, I think, and they had this big truck with lots of tools in the back. Marcus said they were going to help them collect scrap metal and old electronics, but Alex paused, looking down at his feet. But some of the stuff in their truck looked new, not like junk. Helen's concern deepened. Alex might be young, but he was clearly observant and intelligent. If he had noticed inconsistencies in the men's story, there might be legitimate reason to worry about Marcus's safety. "Would you like to go inside and talk to someone?" she offered, just to let them know that Marcus was supposed to be back by now. Alex nodded gratefully. Marcus always says if you're worried about someone, it's better to ask for help too early than too late. The sheriff's office was small but well organized, with a single deputy manning the front desk. Helen recognized him as Tom Bradley, a man she had seen around town during her monthly supply runs. He looked up with interest when they entered. Helen Miller was known in Cedar Falls, but she had never set foot in the sheriff's office before. "Morning, Miss Miller," Deputy Bradley said politely. "What can I do for you folks?" Helen looked at Alex encouragingly, and the boy stepped forward with the same careful composure he had shown since she met him. "Sir, my name is Alex, and I'm looking for my brother Marcus. He was supposed to come back yesterday, but he hasn't shown up yet, and I'm getting worried about him." Deputy Bradley's demeanor shifted to professional attention. "How old are you, Alex? And how old is Marcus?" "I'm 10, and Marcus is 18. He's been taking care of me since we aged out of foster care." The deputy nodded, making notes on a pad. "When did you last see Marcus?" 5 weeks ago. He got a job with some men doing salvage work. They said it would take a few weeks, but he promised to be back by Christmas Eve." "Do you know the names of these men, or what company they worked for?" Alex glanced at Helen, who gave him an encouraging nod. "The boss was named Terry, I think, and they had a big truck with tools. Marcus said they were collecting scrap metal and old electronics, but some of the stuff in their truck looked new to me." Deputy Bradley's pen stopped moving, and Helen saw him exchange a meaningful look with another officer who had emerged from a back office. "Alex," the deputy said carefully, "can you describe this truck? What color was it? What size?" "It was white, really big with a covered back, and it had these metal shelves inside for organizing things. Oh, and there were power tools, like the expensive kind you see at hardware stores, not old rusty ones." The second officer stepped forward. "I'm Sheriff Martinez," she said, extending her hand to Alex. "You've been very helpful with these details. We've been investigating some thefts in the area over the past few weeks. People stealing copper, wire, electronics, even power tools from construction sites and storage units." Helen felt her stomach drop. "You think Marcus might be involved in stolen goods?" "We think Marcus might have gotten mixed up with people who weren't entirely honest about what kind of salvage work they were doing," Sheriff Martinez said gently. "The good news is that if he was trying to help you folks and got in over his head, there are ways we can help him. The bad news is that if this crew is who I think it is, they've been operating throughout several counties and they might have moved on." Alex's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Marcus wouldn't steal things on purpose. He always says taking what isn't yours just makes life harder for everyone." "I believe you," Sheriff Martinez said kindly. "And if Marcus was tricked into joining this operation, that makes him more of a victim than a criminal. But Alex, we need to talk about where you've been staying while Marcus has been gone." Helen stepped forward before Alex could answer. "He's been staying with me. I have a place up on Widow's Peak Road." Sheriff Martinez raised her eyebrows. "You're taking care of him?" "Temporarily," Helen said, though even as she said it, she realized that temporarily might not accurately describe what was happening. "Until Marcus returns, Ms. Miller, I appreciate your willingness to help, but there are procedures we need to follow when it comes to unaccompanied minors. We'll need to contact social services and—" "No," Alex said suddenly, his voice sharp with fear. "Please don't call social services. They'll just put me in another foster home, and when Marcus comes back, he won't know where to find me." Helen felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. "Sheriff Martinez, Alex has been through enough disruption. He's safe, he's well cared for, and he needs stability right now, not more bureaucratic shuffling. Can't we work something out temporarily?" The sheriff studied Helen's face for a long moment. "Ms. Miller, you haven't exactly been involved in community affairs. Are you sure you're prepared to take on this kind of responsibility?" Helen looked down at Alex, who was watching her with the same expression of desperate hope she had seen at the depot. In that moment, she realized that her decade of isolation was officially over. She was choosing to become involved, choosing to take responsibility, choosing to fight for this child who had somehow awakened every protective instinct. She had spent 10 years suppressing, "I'm sure," she said firmly. "Alex can stay with me while you look for Marcus. And Sheriff, I hope you'll keep us informed about your investigation. This boy has been through enough uncertainty." Sheriff Martinez nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do about keeping things unofficial for now, given that it's Christmas Eve and social services is closed anyway. But we'll need to have a more formal conversation after the holiday." As they left the sheriff's office, Alex was quiet, processing everything they had learned. Helen felt a weight of new responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was now officially Alex's temporary guardian, and Marcus was potentially involved with criminals who might not want him to return home. "Miss Helen," Alex said as they got back into her truck, "do you think Marcus is in trouble?" Helen considered how to answer honestly without destroying the boy's hope. "I think Marcus might have gotten involved with people who weren't truthful with him about what kind of work they were doing, but I also think he's smart and resourceful, and the sheriff seems like she wants to help." Alex nodded, then looked up at her with an expression that was far too mature for his 10 years. "Whatever happens with Marcus, thank you for saying you'd take care of me. I know you don't really know us, but you're being really kind." Helen felt tears threaten for the second time in 2 days, an emotional response that had been rare for her over the past decade. "Alex, I want you to know that regardless of what happens, you're not alone in this. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Alex said softly. "And Miss Helen, I think Marcus is going to really like you when he meets you." As Helen drove them back toward her mountain cabin, she realized that Christmas Eve was unfolding in ways she never could have imagined. She was no longer a woman hiding from the world. She was someone with people depending on her, someone with a stake in outcomes she couldn't control, someone whose heart was opening despite all her efforts to keep it safely closed. And for the first time in 10 years, that thought didn't terrify her. Instead, it felt like coming back to life. Back at the cabin, Helen found herself unable to settle into her usual routines. The conversation at the sheriff's office had planted seeds of worry that continued to grow as the day progressed. She watched Alex, who had spent the afternoon reading and periodically checking the window for any sign of approaching vehicles, and recognized the careful way he was managing his own anxiety. "Alex," she said finally, settling into the chair, across from where he sat with his book, "I've been thinking about what you told the sheriff this morning, about Marcus and those men. Can you tell me more about that day when you met them?" Alex set down his book and folded his hands in his lap, the gesture somehow making him look even younger. "It was at the boarding house in Millfield. Mrs. Patterson said there were some men looking for workers, and Marcus had been trying to find a job for weeks." Helen leaned forward slightly. "What did Marcus say about them after they left?" "He seemed excited at first," Alex admitted. "They offered him more money than any other job he'd applied for, but that night, after I was supposed to be asleep, I heard him talking to himself the way he does when he's worried about something." "What was he saying?" Alex's brow furrowed with concentration. "Something about hoping he was making the right choice, and he kept looking at this old backpack we found at a thrift store. It had lots of pockets and was really sturdy. He said he might need it for carrying tools." Helen felt a chill. "Did he take the backpack with him when he left?" "Yes. He packed it with some of his clothes and that notebook where he writes down important things." Alex paused, then added quietly, "He also packed the old work clothes from his last construction job, the ones that were already torn and dirty." The significance of this detail wasn't lost on Helen. If Marcus had deliberately packed old, expendable clothes, he might have suspected that the work would be rougher or more dangerous than the men had described. "Alex, I know you said Marcus always keeps his promises, but do you think it's possible that something happened to prevent him from coming back on time? Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't." Alex was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered valley. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "Marcus always says that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And those men were offering a lot of money for not very much work." Helen felt a surge of pride in both Alex's intelligence and Marcus's parenting. Despite their difficult circumstances, Marcus had clearly been teaching his brother to think critically about the world around them. "Have you tried calling him?" she asked. "Does Marcus have a phone?" "He has this old flip phone that doesn't work very well," Alex said. "I tried calling the first few days, but it just went straight to voicemail, and the voicemail box got full after a while." Helen made a mental note to mention this to Sheriff Martinez. If Marcus's phone wasn't working, it could mean anything, from dead batteries to damaged equipment, or worse, that someone had deliberately disabled it. "Alex, I want you to show me exactly what Marcus packed in that backpack," she said. "Can you remember?" Alex nodded and began listing items with the precision of someone who had learned to keep track of possessions carefully. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 t-shirts, 1 warm sweatshirt, the work clothes, extra socks and underwear, his toothbrush, the notebook, a flashlight, and his lucky coin. Lucky coin. "It's this old silver dollar that Marcus found when we first went into foster care," Alex explained. "He always carries it when he's nervous about something. He says it reminds him that sometimes valuable things get lost, but if you're patient and keep looking, you can find them again." Helen felt her throat tighten at the metaphor. That's a beautiful way to think about it. "Marcus is good with words like that," Alex said proudly. "He used to write stories when we lived with the Hendersons. They were our best foster family. Mrs. Henderson said Marcus had talent and should think about going to college for writing someday." This revelation added another layer to Helen's understanding of Marcus, an 18-year-old with literary aspirations who found himself responsible for a 10-year-old brother, struggling to survive in a system that had failed them both. No wonder he had jumped at the chance for quick money, even if something about the offer had made him uneasy. "Alex, you mentioned that Marcus writes in a notebook. What kinds of things does he write about?" "All kinds of stuff. He writes down places we've been, people who helped us, things he wants to remember. And sometimes he writes letters to our parents, even though they died when I was really little." Helen's heart clenched. "Do you remember your parents?" Alex shook his head. "Not really, but Marcus tells me stories about them sometimes. He says our mom used to sing lullabies in Spanish, and our dad taught Marcus how to fix things with his hands. Marcus says, 'I look like Mom, but I'm stubborn like Dad.'" The picture of their family was becoming clearer. Children who had lost their parents young, been separated and reunited through the foster system, and were now trying to build a life together against significant odds. Helen found herself thinking about the face-down photograph on her mantelpiece and wondering what Marcus and Alex would think if they knew about the family she had lost. "Miss Helen?" Alex's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you have family? I mean, besides your husband who died?" Helen felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but instead of the usual impulse to deflect or change the subject, she found herself wanting to answer honestly. "I had a daughter once," she said quietly. "Her name was Sarah. She would be 25. Now if..." Helen stopped, realizing she was about to share more than she had spoken aloud in 10 years. Alex waited patiently, sensing that this was important. "Sarah died when she was 15, Helen continued, her voice steady despite the pain. "And after that I couldn't bear to stay in the world we had shared together. So I came here to be alone. I'm sorry." Alex said with the gravity of someone who understood loss. Was she sick? Helen shook her head. She was in a car accident. A drunk driver hit the car she was riding in with some friends. Alex was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he asked, "Is that why you helped me? Because you miss taking care of someone?" The question was so perceptive and so gently asked that Helen had to blink back tears. "Maybe," she admitted. "I think I forgot how good it feels to be needed by someone." Marcus says that needing people and being needed is what makes us human, Alex offered. He says even when it hurts sometimes, it's better than being alone. Helen looked at this wise, resilient child and realized that Marcus had been teaching his brother lessons she had spent 10 years trying to unlearn. About connection, about hope, about the way love persisted even in the face of loss and uncertainty. "Your brother sounds like a very wise young man," she said. "He is," Alex agreed. "That's why I know he's trying to come back, and why I think something bad might have happened to stop him." Helen felt a surge of determination. If Marcus was in trouble, whether through his own poor judgment or because he had been deceived by criminals, then Alex deserved to know the truth. And Marcus deserved whatever help she could provide. "Alex, would you be willing to help me do some investigating? Nothing dangerous," she added quickly. "But maybe we can find out more about these men Marcus went to work for." Alex's eyes brightened, with something that looked like relief. "You mean we're going to look for him?" "I mean we're going to see what we can find out," Helen corrected carefully. "The sheriff is already investigating, but there might be things we can discover that would help her." "What kind of things?" Helen stood up and walked to her desk, where she kept a small laptop computer she used for ordering supplies and staying informed about weather conditions. "Well, we could start by researching salvage operations in the area, see if any legitimate companies match the description Marcus gave you, and we could check local news reports for any mention of thefts or arrests." Alex joined her at the desk, watching as she opened the laptop. "Marcus taught me how to use computers at the library in Millfield. I'm pretty good at finding information." Over the next hour, they worked together searching for any trace of the operation Marcus had joined. Alex proved to be surprisingly adept at online research, navigating between news sites and business directories with the skill of someone who had learned to gather information efficiently. They discovered several disturbing facts. First, there had been a significant increase in theft reports throughout the region over the past 2 months, exactly the time frame when Marcus had been working with the crew. Second, the thefts seemed to follow a pattern, targeting rural properties and construction sites where valuable materials and tools were stored. Third, law enforcement in several counties had been coordinating their investigations, suggesting that the operation was larger and more organized than a simple opportunistic theft ring. "Look at this," Alex said, pointing to a news article from 3 weeks earlier. "It says they caught one of the thieves trying to sell stolen copper wire to a recycling center in Denver, but he wouldn't tell police who he was working with." Helen read the article carefully. The arrested man was described as young, possibly homeless, and apparently working as a low-level member of a larger organization. The pattern was becoming clear. The crew recruited vulnerable young people, likely with promises of easy money, then used them to carry out thefts while the leaders remained safely in the background. "Alex," Helen said gently, "I think Marcus might have realized that he had gotten involved with something illegal, and I think he might have tried to get out." Alex nodded solemnly. "That sounds like something Marcus would do. He always says if you realize you're making a mistake, the brave thing to do is try to fix it, even if it's scary." Helen felt a chill as she realized the implications. If Marcus had tried to leave the operation or threatened to expose it, he could be in serious danger. The kind of people who organized theft rings weren't likely to let potential witnesses simply walk away. "We need to call Sheriff Martinez," she said, reaching for her phone. But before she could dial, they heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the mountain road. Alex jumped up from his chair, his face bright with hope. That might be Marcus. He exclaimed, running to the window. Helen joined him, and they both peered out into the gathering dusk. A pickup truck was indeed making its way up the winding road toward her cabin, but as it got closer, Helen could see that it wasn't driven by a young man who looked like Alex. Instead, it was Sheriff Martinez herself, and she was not alone. Sheriff Martinez was accompanied by Deputy Bradley, and both officers looked serious as Helen opened the door to let them in. Alex hung back slightly, his earlier excitement replaced by wariness. Children who had lived in the foster system often developed finely tuned instincts about when official visits might bring bad news. "Ms. Miller." "Alex," Sheriff Martinez said, removing her hat as she entered. "I hope you don't mind us coming by, but we've had some developments in our investigation that I thought you should hear about." Helen felt her stomach clench. "Please sit down. Can I get you coffee?" "That would be nice, thank you," the sheriff said, settling into one of Helen's living room chairs while keeping her attention focused on Alex. "Alex, I want you to know that we've been working hard to find out what happened to Marcus." Alex perched on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Did you find him?" "Not yet," Sheriff Martinez said gently, "but we've learned quite a bit about the people he was working with, and I'm afraid some of it confirms our worst suspicions." Helen returned from the kitchen with coffee, her own hands not entirely steady. As she set the cups down, "What kind of developments?" Deputy Bradley opened a small notebook. "We got word this afternoon from the Denver police. They've arrested 3 members of a theft ring that's been operating throughout Colorado and Wyoming. One of them is talking, and he's provided information about their recruiting methods." "What kind of recruiting methods?" Helen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "They target young people in vulnerable situations," the deputy explained. "Homeless youth, kids aging out of foster care, anyone who needs money quickly and might not ask too many questions about the legality of the work." Alex's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Marcus needed money for us. He would have taken any job that paid well." "That's exactly what they counted on," Sheriff Martinez said. "According to our informant, they would approach young men like Marcus and offer them what seemed like legitimate salvage work. But once the recruits were isolated and dependent on the crew for transportation and housing, they would gradually involve them in more serious crimes." Helen felt sick. So Marcus might not have known what he was getting into until it was too late to get out safely. "That's our theory," the sheriff confirmed. "And if Marcus tried to leave or threatened to report the operation, he could be in real danger." Alex was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his voice was determined. "Marcus isn't a criminal. If he did anything wrong, it was because they tricked him or made him do it." "We believe that, Alex," Sheriff Martinez said kindly. "And if we can find Marcus, we'll make sure the district attorney understands that he was more of a victim than a participant. But right now, our priority is finding him before something bad happens." Helen reached over and squeezed Alex's hand. "What do you need from us to help with the search?" Deputy Bradley consulted his notebook again. "We'd like Alex to look at some photographs, see if he can identify any of the men Marcus went to work with. And we need a more detailed description of Marcus, height, weight, any distinguishing marks. The more specific information we have, the better we can coordinate with other law enforcement agencies." "I can do that," Alex said immediately. "I remember everything about Marcus." Sheriff Martinez pulled a folder from her briefcase and set it on the coffee table. "These are surveillance photos from several locations where thefts occurred. The quality isn't great, but you might recognize someone." Alex leaned forward to examine the photographs, his young face serious with concentration. Helen watched him study each image carefully, and she could see the moment when he recognized something. "This one," Alex said, pointing to a grainy photo that showed several men loading items into a truck. "That looks like the truck I saw, with the metal shelves in the back. And this man here," He pointed to a figure partially obscured by shadows. "I think that might be Terry, the boss." "Good," Deputy Bradley said, making notes. "What else can you tell us about Terry? Height, hair color, age?" "He was taller than Marcus, with grey hair and a beard. Maybe as old as Miss Helen's dad would be, if he was still alive. And he had this really loud voice, like he was used to people doing what he said." Helen felt a stab of pain at Alex's casual reference to her father's age, but she pushed it aside to focus on the investigation. "Did you notice anything else about him? Clothes, jewelry, the way he talked?" Alex nodded thoughtfully. "He wore these really expensive-looking boots, like the ones rich ranchers wear in movies. And he had a big ring on his right hand that caught the light. Oh, and he talked like he was from somewhere else. Not exactly an accent, but different from how people talk around here." Sheriff Martinez exchanged a look with her deputy. "Alex, you're very observant. These details are exactly the kind of information that helps us track people down." "Marcus taught me to notice things," Alex said simply. "He says when you don't have much, you need to pay attention to everything, because you never know what might be important later." Helen felt her admiration for Marcus growing with every story Alex shared. Despite their circumstances, he had been raising his little brother to be thoughtful, observant, and resilient. "Now," Sheriff Martinez said, "we need to talk about Marcus himself. Can you give us a detailed description?" Alex straightened, as if this was the most important question he had ever been asked. "Marcus is 18, but he looks older because he's really tall, and he works out when he can. He's about 6 feet, maybe a little more, and he has dark hair like mine, but longer. He keeps it tied back sometimes when he's working. He has brown eyes and this scar on his left hand from when he helped fix a fence at one of our foster homes." "Any tattoos or other distinguishing marks?" "No tattoos. Marcus says he'll get one someday when we have enough money and he can choose something really meaningful. But he has this birthmark on his shoulder that looks kind of like a crescent moon." Helen watched Alex describe his brother with such precise detail and realized that this child had been preparing for exactly this kind of conversation, memorizing the details that might someday help someone find Marcus if he went missing. The thought broke her heart. "What was Marcus wearing when he left?" Deputy Bradley asked. Alex closed his eyes, apparently visualizing the last time he had seen his brother. His good jeans, the ones without holes, a blue t-shirt with a logo from some construction company. His work boots, they're brown and pretty, beat up, and his grey hoodie, the one I bought him for his birthday last year, with money I saved from helping Mrs. Patterson with her garden. The personal details made Marcus real for Helen in a way that even Alex's stories hadn't quite managed. She could picture this young man who wore hand-me-down clothes but kept them neat, who accepted a birthday gift from his 10-year-old brother with the grace of someone who understood that love mattered more than money. Sheriff Martinez closed her folder and leaned forward. "Alex, I want you to know that we're going to do everything we can to find Marcus. We've got law enforcement agencies in 4 states looking for this theft ring, and now that we have better descriptions of both the suspects and Marcus himself, our chances of success are much better." "How long do you think it will take?" Alex asked. The sheriff hesitated, and Helen could see her struggling with how much honesty was appropriate for a 10-year-old. "I can't give you a specific timeline, Alex. These investigations can move quickly once we get a break, but they can also take weeks or even months." Alex's face fell, but he nodded with the resignation of someone who had learned to accept disappointing news with dignity. "I understand, but you'll keep looking, right? Even after Christmas?" "Absolutely," Sheriff Martinez assured him. "This is an active investigation, and it's not going to stop just because of the holidays." Helen felt compelled to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Sheriff, what's the likelihood that Marcus is—" She paused, not wanting to say the words in front of Alex. "We have no reason to believe that Marcus has been seriously harmed," the sheriff said carefully. These crews typically use intimidation and isolation to control their workers, not violence. Marcus is probably being held somewhere against his will, but he's likely alive and unharmed. Alex looked up sharply. You mean they're keeping him prisoner? It's possible, Deputy Bradley said gently. Sometimes when someone in these operations tries to leave or threatens to talk to police, the leaders will hold them somewhere until the heat dies down. It's a way of protecting the operation without resorting to more serious crimes. Helen could see Alex processing this information, and she was struck again by his maturity. So Marcus might be trying to get back to me, but he can't. That's exactly what we think might be happening, Sheriff Martinez said, which is why we're working so hard to find him. The officers gathered their materials and prepared to leave, but Sheriff Martinez paused at the door. Ms. Miller, I hope you understand that this investigation could take a while. Are you prepared for the possibility that Alex might need to stay with you for an extended period? Helen looked at Alex, who was watching her with the same expression of desperate hope she had seen at the depot. Yes, she said without hesitation. Alex can stay here as long as necessary. What about after we find Marcus? Alex asked quietly. I mean, if he got in trouble with the law, even if it wasn't his fault, will they still let him take care of me? The question hung in the air for a moment, and Helen realized that Alex had been thinking about possibilities that went far beyond simply finding his brother. He was preparing himself for the chance that even if Marcus was found alive well, their life together might still be over. That will depend on a lot of factors, Sheriff Martinez said honestly. But Alex, the most important thing right now is finding Marcus and making sure he's safe. We'll worry about the rest later. After the officers left, Helen and Alex sat in the living room, both lost in thought. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and outside the windows, snow was beginning to fall more heavily. It should have been peaceful, but Helen could feel the weight of all the questions they couldn't answer. Miss Helen, Alex said finally. Yes? If they find Marcus, but he has to go to jail, would you... Alex stopped, apparently unable to finish the question. Helen moved to sit beside him on the couch. Would I what, Alex? Would you let me stay here anyway? I mean, I know you don't really know me, and I know I'm not your real family, but Helen felt tears threaten again. Alex, listen to me very carefully. You are not alone in this. Whatever happens with Marcus, whether they find him tomorrow or whether it takes months, whether he's in trouble or whether he's completely innocent, you have a place here with me for as long as you need it. Do you understand? Alex nodded, but Helen could see that he was struggling to believe it. She realized that this child had probably heard promises from adults before, promises that had been broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. I mean it, Alex. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Alex leaned against her then, the first time he had allowed himself that kind of physical comfort since she had found him at the depot. Helen wrapped her arms around his small shoulders and felt something she had thought was permanently broken begin to heal inside her chest. They sat together in the firelight, and Helen found herself thinking about the newspaper clipping they had found during their research, evidence of crimes that had swept Marcus into a situation far more dangerous than either brother could have anticipated. She thought about the life these two boys had built together against impossible odds, and about the love that had sustained Alex through 5 weeks of uncertainty and fear. She thought about her own daughter, Sarah, and about the 10 years she had spent hiding from a world that had taken everything she loved. But looking down at Alex's dark hair and feeling the trust he had placed in her, Helen realized that maybe the world hadn't taken everything after all. Maybe it had been waiting to give her something new, not a replacement for what she had lost, but a different kind of love, a different kind of family, a different reason to hope. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, Marcus was either fighting to return to his little brother or being prevented from keeping the most important promise he had ever made. But inside Helen's warm cabin, Two people who had found each other in their respective darknesses were discovering that some kinds of love didn't require blood relation or legal documentation. Sometimes, Helen thought, as she held Alex close and listened to his steady breathing, family was simply a choice you made to protect someone who needed protecting, to love someone who needed loving, and to stay when everyone else had left. And for the first time in 10 years, that felt like enough. 3 days after Christmas, Helen was awakened at dawn by the insistent ringing of her landline telephone. She stumbled from bed, her heart immediately racing with the kind of panic that came from knowing bad news often arrived with early morning phone calls. Alex appeared in the hallway, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes wide with the same apprehension. "Ms. Miller, this is Sheriff Martinez. I'm sorry to call so early, but we've had a break in the case. Can you and Alex come down to the station this morning?" Helen felt her pulse quicken. "Did you find Marcus?" "I'd rather discuss this in person," the sheriff said carefully. "Can you be here by 9 o'clock? The drive to Cedar Falls seemed to take forever, with Alex pressed against the passenger window, watching for any sign that might indicate whether the news would be good or bad. Helen found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, preparing for possibilities she didn't want to consider. The sheriff's office was busier than Helen had ever seen it, with several vehicles parked outside and unfamiliar officers moving in and out of the building. Sheriff Martinez met them at the front door, her expression serious but not devastated, a detail Helen found cautiously encouraging. "Before we go in," the sheriff said, "I want you both to know that Marcus is alive." Alex's face transformed with relief so profound that Helen had to steady him with a hand on his shoulder. "He's okay. Where is he? Can I see him?" "He's okay in the sense that he's not seriously injured," Sheriff Martinez said carefully, "but the situation is complicated, and I need to prepare you for some things that might be difficult to hear." They were led into a conference room where Deputy Bradley was waiting with a man Helen didn't recognize, a middle-aged detective in a wrinkled suit who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "This is Detective Ramirez from the Colorado State Police," Sheriff Martinez explained. "He's been coordinating the multi-county investigation into the theft ring." Detective Ramirez shook hands with Helen and nodded kindly at Alex. "Young man, we found your brother yesterday evening. He's being held at a secure facility about 2 hours from here." "What kind of secure facility?" Helen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "He's in custody," the detective said gently. "But before you panic, let me explain the circumstances." Alex's face went pale, but he remained standing straight, his hands clenched at his sides. Helen moved closer to him, offering silent support. "The theft ring your brother was involved with was much larger and more organized than we initially realized," Detective Ramirez continued. "They were operating in 5 states, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and materials. When we finally tracked them down to their base of operations, an abandoned mining facility in Wyoming, we found Marcus, but the situation was not what we expected." Helen felt her stomach clench. "What do you mean?" "Marcus wasn't working with them anymore," Sheriff Martinez said. "He was being held against his will, and he had been for almost 3 weeks. Alex's eyes widened. "They were keeping him prisoner." "More than that," Detective Ramirez said, opening a folder and pulling out what appeared to be a cell phone. "When we arrested the ringleaders, we found this in Marcus's possession. It's been damaged, but our tech team was able to recover some of the data." He set the phone on the table, and Helen could see that the screen was cracked, and the casing was dented. "Is that Marcus's phone?" she asked. "Yes, and what we found on it changes everything we thought we knew about this case." Detective Ramirez pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the table. Marcus had been using his phone to secretly record conversations with the theft ringleaders. He was gathering evidence. Helen felt a chill of understanding. "He was working undercover?" "Not officially," the detective clarified. But about 2 weeks into his employment with the crew, Marcus realized they were involved in serious crimes. Instead of just trying to escape, he decided to gather evidence that could help law enforcement shut down the entire operation. Alex was staring at the damaged phone with something like awe. Marcus was trying to stop them? Your brother recorded hours of conversations over a 3-week period, Sheriff Martinez said. Names, dates, locations, details about past thefts, and plans for future ones. The evidence he gathered is going to put these people away for a very long time. But if he was helping the police, why is he in custody? Helen asked. Detective Ramirez's expression grew more serious. Because when the ringleaders discovered what Marcus was doing, they didn't just hold him prisoner, they forced him to participate in several thefts, threatening to hurt you, Alex, if he didn't cooperate. Alex's breath caught. They threatened me. 4 more days, and I get to see Marcus. Helen watched him burn off nervous energy and realized she was almost as anxious as Alex was. Over the past weeks, Marcus had become real to her in ways that went beyond Alex's stories. She had seen his careful handwriting in the journal entries the police had shared, heard his voice on the recorded evidence he had gathered, and read the letters he had written to Alex but never been able to send. She felt as if she knew him, but she was also acutely aware that their first meeting would determine the future of their unusual family arrangement. That evening, as they sat by the fire, a routine that had become precious to both of them, Alex pulled out his brother's notebook and began reading aloud from entries Marcus had written during his captivity. Day 12. Still no word from the outside. The boss is getting suspicious of everyone, making us work longer hours and watching us more closely. I recorded another conversation today about the job they're planning in Nevada. If I can get this information to the police, it might be enough to stop them before they hurt anyone else. I keep thinking about Alex waiting for me at the depot. I hope he's somewhere warm. I hope someone kind is taking care of him. Alex paused, his voice catching slightly. He was thinking about me even when he was in danger. Helen reached over and squeezed his hand. That's what people who love each other do. They think about each other's safety even when they're scared. Alex continued reading. Day 18. I overheard Terry talking about cleaning up loose ends after the Nevada job. I think he means eliminating people who could identify the operation. I'm definitely on that list. If something happens to me, I hope Alex remembers that every choice I made was to try to keep him safe. I hope he finds people who will love him the way he deserves to be loved. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. Even facing potential death, Marcus had been thinking about Alex's need for love and security. There's more, Alex said, flipping to a later entry. This one is from just a few days before they rescued him. He read in a voice that grew stronger with each word. Day 21. I got word somehow that Alex is safe. A guard mentioned that the police had been asking about him and that he was staying with someone who was taking good care of him. I don't know who this person is, but I'm more grateful than I can express. Knowing Alex is safe gives me the courage to keep fighting. If I make it out of this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure he never has to be scared or hungry or alone again. Alex closed the notebook and looked at Helen with shining eyes. He knew you were taking care of me, and it made him braver. Helen felt the weight of that responsibility, not just the legal guardianship, but the knowledge that her care for Alex had somehow sustained Marcus through his darkest moments. It was a connection she had never experienced before, the way love could create bonds between people who had never even met. Over the next few days, Helen found herself preparing for Marcus's visit with the same careful attention she had once given to lesson plans and parent conferences. She researched the visiting facility, learned about the rules and procedures, and tried to imagine what Marcus might need from their first meeting. But it was Alex who provided the most insight into his brother's likely emotional state. Marcus will probably try to apologize for everything, Alex said, as they drove toward the facility on Saturday morning. "He'll think it's his fault that I ended up alone, and his fault that he got involved with criminals, and his fault that you had to take responsibility for me. What should I say to him?" Helen asked. Alex was quiet for a moment, considering. "Maybe tell him that taking care of me wasn't a burden, and that you understand why he made the choices he did. Marcus needs to know that people don't think he failed." Helen was struck again by Alex's emotional intelligence. This 10-year-old boy understood his 18-year-old brother's psychology better than most adults understood their peers. The correctional facility was smaller and less intimidating than Helen had feared, but it was still clearly a place where people were held against their will. As they went through the check-in process, Helen could see Alex growing more nervous, his earlier excitement tempered by the reality of where they were. "It's going to be okay," she assured him, as they waited in the visitor's room. "Marcus has been waiting to see you just as much as you've been waiting to see him." When Marcus finally appeared, Helen's first thought was that he looked exactly like Alex had described, tall, dark-haired, with the same intelligent brown eyes. But she could also see the changes that weeks of stress and uncertainty had left on his young face. He was thinner than he should be, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much worry. Alex was out of his chair and across the room before Helen could blink, throwing himself into his brother's arms. With the abandon of someone who had spent 6 weeks believing this moment might never happen, Marcus held him close, and Helen could see his shoulders shaking as he tried to control emotions that were too big for the supervised visiting room. When they finally separated, Marcus looked over Alex's head and met Helen's eyes for the first time. What she saw there was gratitude so profound it took her breath away. "You must be Helen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Helen stood and moved closer, noting how Marcus kept one arm around Alex, as if he was afraid his brother might disappear. "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. Alex has been a joy to have in my home." Marcus studied her face intently, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the stories Alex had obviously shared. "He looks good," he said finally, "healthy and happy. I was so afraid." "He's been safe," Helen interrupted gently. "And he's been brave. And he never stopped believing you would come back." Tears started down Marcus's face then, and Helen realized that this young man had been carrying impossible burdens for far too long. Not just the responsibility of caring for his little brother, but the weight of trying to protect Alex from a world that had failed them both repeatedly. The visit passed too quickly. Filled with Alex's stories about life at the cabin, Marcus's careful questions about Helen's willingness to continue caring for Alex, and the beginning of conversations about what their future might look like. As visiting time ended, Helen could see the anxiety building in both brothers about having to separate again. "Marcus," she said, as the guard signaled that time was up, "I want you to know that Alex isn't just staying with me temporarily. He has a permanent home with me for as long as he needs it, whether that's until you're released or for years to come. You don't have to worry about him anymore." Marcus looked at her with an expression of wonder. "You would do that? Really keep him, even if my legal troubles drag on?" "Marcus, Alex isn't a burden or an obligation," Helen said firmly. "He's become my family, and that means you're my family too. We're going to get through this together." As they prepared to leave, Marcus pulled Helen aside while Alex was gathering his things. "Helen," he said quietly, "Alex told me about your daughter, about how you lost her and came to the mountains to be alone. I need you to know that giving Alex a home when you'd chosen to live without family, that's the most generous thing anyone has ever done for us." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Marcus, taking care of Alex has given me a reason to live again. If anything, I should be thanking you for trusting me with him." Marcus shook his head. "We're going to be okay, aren't we? All three of us?" Helen looked at this young man who had risked his life to gather evidence against criminals, who had endured captivity to protect his little brother, who was facing legal consequences with dignity and hope. Then she looked at Alex, whose faith and resilience had pulled her out of a decade of hiding. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty, "we're going to be more than okay. We're going to be a family." As they drove home that evening, Alex was quieter than usual, processing the complex emotions of seeing Marcus in confinement. But when they pulled into their driveway and looked at the cabin where Helen's old ham radio sat waiting in the window, the radio that had become their link to the outside world during the investigation, Alex smiled. "Marcus is going to love it here," he said simply, "and he's going to love you." Helen looked at the radio that had helped coordinate Marcus's rescue and realized it had become more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of communication, of reaching out instead of withdrawing, of using whatever tools you had to help the people you loved. Tomorrow would bring more legal proceedings, more paperwork, more steps in the long process of officially becoming a family. But tonight, Helen Miller was no longer a woman hiding from the world. She was someone with people depending on her, someone with a future to plan, someone whose heart was full of hope instead of emptied by loss. And for the first time since Sarah's death, that felt like coming home. 6 weeks after their first visit, Helen was awakened by the telephone at 5 in the morning. This time, however, instead of panic, she felt a surge of anticipation. Sheriff Martinez had warned them that Marcus's release date might be moved up if his community service placement was finalized early. "Ms. Miller." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the tone was warm. "This is Janet Collins from the Mountain County Community Service Program. I'm calling to let you know that Marcus Rivera has completed all the requirements for his early release. He'll be discharged this afternoon if you're able to provide transportation." Helen's heart leaped. "Of course. What time should we be there?" "Any time after 2 o'clock. And Ms. Miller, I wanted you to know that Marcus has been exemplary during his service. He's been working with our literacy program, teaching reading skills to other young people in the system. The program coordinator says he has a real gift for helping people." After Helen hung up, she found Alex already standing in the hallway, his eyes bright with excitement and hope. "Was that about Marcus?" he asked. "He's coming home today," Helen said, and watched as Alex's face transformed with joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. They spent the morning preparing in their own ways. Alex cleaned his room obsessively, organized his books, and made sure Marcus's notebook and phone were waiting on the nightstand. Helen found herself cooking with an energy she hadn't felt in years, preparing a welcome home meal that would show Marcus he wasn't just being tolerated, he was being celebrated. But as afternoon approached, Helen noticed that Alex's excitement was being tempered by nervousness. "What if he's different?" Alex asked as they drove toward the facility. "I mean, not bad different, but what if everything that happened changed him? What if he doesn't feel like my brother anymore?" Helen understood the fear. Trauma could change people in unpredictable ways, and Alex had been through his own transformation during the weeks of uncertainty. "Alex, do you feel like the same person you were when I first met you at the depot?" Alex considered this seriously. "No, I guess not. I feel safer now, and less afraid of things." "But do you still love Marcus the same way?" "More," Alex said without hesitation. "I love him more because I understand better how much he was trying to protect me." Helen smiled. "I think you'll find that Marcus still loves you the same way too, maybe even more, now that he knows what it feels like to almost lose you." When Marcus walked out of the facility that afternoon, Helen was struck by how different he looked from their first meeting. He had gained back some weight, the shadows under his eyes had faded, and there was something in his posture that suggested he had found a measure of peace with what had happened. But it was the way his face lit up when he saw Alex running toward him that told Helen everything she needed to know about whether prison had changed him fundamentally. Some bonds, she realized, were strong enough to survive anything. The drive back to the cabin, was filled with Alex's chatter about everything that had happened during Marcus's final weeks away, the legal proceedings, the mountain wildlife he'd been observing, the books he'd been reading, and his plans for showing Marcus around their new home. Helen watched Marcus in the rearview mirror, noting how he listened to every word with complete attention, as if he was memorizing the sound of his brother's voice. When Alex paused for breath, Marcus looked up and caught Helen's eyes in the mirror. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying weight far beyond simple politeness. "Thank you for trusting me with him," Helen replied, "and for trusting me with both of you." As they pulled into the driveway, Helen could see Marcus taking in the surroundings, the way the cabin sat nestled among the trees, the view of the valley below, the sense of safety and permanence that the location provided. "It's beautiful," he said, stepping out of the truck and looking around with wonder. "Alex described it, but I didn't imagine. It's like a sanctuary." "That's exactly what it was meant to be," Helen said, realizing as she spoke that the cabin was still serving that purpose, just for a different kind of healing now. Alex grabbed Marcus's hand and began pulling him toward the house, eager to show him everything. Helen watched them walk together up the path, noting how Marcus had to adjust his long stride to match Alex's excitement, and felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. Inside the cabin, Marcus stopped just past the threshold, his eyes taking in the warm lighting, the comfortable furniture, the walls lined with books, and the general atmosphere of a place where people were safe and cared for. "Alex wasn't exaggerating," he said softly. "This really does feel like home." Helen felt her chest tighten with emotion. "It is your home, Marcus, for as long as you want it to be." Alex led his brother on a tour that included every corner of the small cabin, pointing out the guest room that would be Marcus's, the bookshelf where he'd been choosing his bedtime reading, the kitchen table where they did homework and paperwork, and the living room where they sat by the fire in the evenings. But it was when they reached the mantelpiece that Marcus stopped and grew quiet. Helen followed his gaze and realized he was looking at the silver-framed photograph that was no longer turned face down. "Is that your daughter?" he asked gently. Helen nodded. "Sarah. She would have been about your age if—" She paused, then continued. "I turned that picture upright the day Alex and I became an official family. It felt like it was time for her to meet you both." Marcus studied the photograph for a long moment, then looked at Helen with an expression of deep understanding. "She's beautiful, and I bet she would have loved Alex." "I think so too," Helen said, surprised by how easily the words came. "And I think she would have been impressed by the way you've taken care of him." Alex looked between them, sensing the significance of the moment. "Miss Helen says people we love never really leave us, even when we can't see them anymore." Marcus nodded solemnly. "That's true, and I think the people we love want us to be happy even after they're gone." They spent the afternoon in the comfortable rhythms of settling Marcus into the household. Helen watched him unpack his few possessions, mostly books and letters Alex had sent during their separation, and was struck by how little he owned and how much he valued what he had. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table eating Helen's welcome home meal, Marcus looked at both of them with an expression that seemed to hold years of gratitude. "I need to say something," he began, his voice serious. "Helen, what you've done for Alex, for both of us, is beyond anything I could have hoped for or imagined. You didn't just give him a place to stay, you gave him a family." Helen started to protest, but Marcus continued. "And Alex, I need you to know how proud I am of how you handled everything. The way you waited for me, the way you trusted Helen, the way you've grown during these months. You've been braver than I ever could have been at your age." Alex's eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't brave. I was scared most of the time. Being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. That's exactly what brave means," Marcus said firmly. "And I need both of you to know that what happened with the theft ring wasn't anyone's fault, except the people who lied to me and threatened you. We're not victims anymore. We're survivors, and we're family." Helen felt a warmth spread through her chest that she recognized as the feeling of being exactly where she belonged. "We are family," she agreed, "all three of us." As they cleared the dinner dishes together, Helen realized that the evening felt like something she had been unconsciously waiting for her entire life. The simple pleasure of caring for people who cared for her in return, the satisfaction of a kitchen filled with conversation and laughter, the security of knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. Later, as Alex and Marcus sat on the couch catching up on weeks of separation, Helen stepped outside onto her front porch and looked up at the stars that had once seemed distant and cold, but now felt like witnesses to the transformation of her life. When she went back inside, she found the brothers looking through Marcus's journal together, Alex reading aloud from entries he had missed, while Marcus added context and explanations. "There's something I want to show you both," Helen said, moving to the desk where she kept her own writing materials. She pulled out a manila folder and set it on the coffee table. "These are the guardianship papers that make our family official. But there's something else in here too." She opened the folder and withdrew a document she had been working on for several days. "I've been thinking about what happens next, and I realize there are some things I want to make official beyond just the legal guardianship." Marcus and Alex leaned forward, reading over the document with growing amazement. "You want to adopt both of us?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to offer that option," Helen corrected gently. "I understand that you both have been taking care of yourselves and each other for a long time, and you might not want or need another parent figure. But if you're interested, I would be honored to make this family legally permanent." Alex looked at Marcus with an expression that was part question and part hope. Helen could see them having one of their wordless conversations, the kind that siblings develop when they've depended on each other for survival. "Helen," Marcus said finally, "we've never had anyone offer us a forever family before. Are you sure you want to take on 2 kids, especially with everything we've been through?" Helen looked at these 2 remarkable young people who had somehow found their way into her heart and her home, and realized that her answer came without hesitation. "Marcus, Alex, you 2 have given me more joy and purpose in the past few months than I've had in 10 years. You haven't been a burden, you've been a gift, and if you'll have me, I would love nothing more than to be your mom." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of possibility, of second chances, of love that transcended biology and circumstance. Then Alex launched himself into Helen's arms, followed immediately by Marcus, and Helen found herself enveloped in the kind of hug she had thought she would never experience again. "Yes," Alex said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Yes, we want you to adopt us." "Both of us," Marcus added, his own voice thick with emotion. "If you're really sure." Helen held them both close and realized that her decade of hiding from the world had been preparation for this moment, for becoming the kind of person who could provide the stability and love that Marcus and Alex needed, and for opening her heart to the possibility that family could be chosen as well as born. "I'm sure," she said firmly, "we're going to be okay, all 3 of us together." And for the first time since Sarah's death, Helen Miller believed completely in the promise of tomorrow. The weeks that followed Marcus's homecoming settled into rhythms that felt both new and timeless. Helen watched her household transform as Marcus brought his own gentle presence to their daily routines. He was quieter than Alex, more thoughtful in his movements, but his dry sense of humor and his obvious devotion to his brother added warmth to every interaction. What struck Helen most was how naturally Marcus fit into the role of older brother, while also accepting her authority as the adult in their household. He helped Alex with homework, contributed to household chores without being asked, and began exploring the mountain trails around the cabin with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. "I've never lived anywhere this peaceful," Marcus confided to Helen one evening as they stood on the front porch, watching Alex chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong." Helen understood that feeling. "It takes time to trust that good things can last," she said. But Marcus, you don't have to wait for the other shoe to drop anymore. This is your home, and it's going to stay your home. Marcus nodded, but she could see him still processing the reality of security after so many years of uncertainty. Helen, can I ask you something? Of course. Why us? I mean, you could have called social services that first night and handed Alex over to the system. You could have stayed uninvolved. What made you decide to change your entire life for two kids you didn't even know? Helen considered the question, watching Alex's joy as he successfully caught a firefly and then immediately released it. I think, she said slowly, it was because Alex reminded me what it felt like to hope for something, and you reminded me what it looked like to fight for someone you love, even when you'd lost someone you loved yourself. Helen felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but it was gentler now, more like an old ache than a sharp wound. Especially then, losing Sarah taught me how precious love is. Finding you and Alex taught me that love doesn't end just because someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow. That conversation marked a turning point for Marcus. Over the following days, Helen watched him begin to truly relax into their life together. He started leaving his few possessions scattered around the house instead of keeping them carefully packed. He began making plans that extended weeks and months into the future. He started calling Helen Mom in casual conversation, as if testing how the word felt. The adoption paperwork moved more quickly than Helen had expected, helped by the unusual circumstances of their case and Marcus's legal troubles that had paradoxically demonstrated his character. The social worker assigned to their case, Mrs. Patterson, a different Mrs. Patterson than the boarding house owner, Helen was relieved to learn, seemed genuinely impressed by what she found during her home visits. In 20 years of doing this work, Mrs. Patterson told Helen during her final evaluation, I've rarely seen such a natural fit between children and a prospective parent. These boys clearly feel safe and loved, and you obviously understand their needs. Alex had been characteristically direct during his interview. Helen isn't trying to replace our real parents, he had told the social worker. She's being the parent we need now. That's different, and it's exactly right. Marcus had been more complex in his assessment, but equally convinced. Helen gave us hope when we had none, he had said. She made us feel like we deserved good things. That's not something you can fake or force. It's either real or it isn't. And with Helen, it's real. The final adoption hearing was scheduled for a warm day in late spring, nearly 6 months after Helen had first encountered Alex at the depot. As they dressed that morning, Helen realized she was more nervous than she had been for any event since Sarah's funeral. What if something goes wrong? She asked Alex as he helped her choose which dress to wear to court. Alex looked at her with the patient expression he wore when adults were being unnecessarily worried about obvious things. Mom, he said, using the title that had become natural. For all of them, we're already a family. The court is just going to write it down on paper. Marcus, overhearing from the hallway, added, Besides, have you seen how much paperwork we've already filled out? There's no way they're going to let all that effort go to waste. His attempt at humor made Helen laugh, releasing some of the tension she'd been carrying. These boys had already survived so much uncertainty, they weren't going to let a legal formality shake their confidence in their future together. The courthouse was smaller and less intimidating than Helen had imagined. Judge Morrison, a woman about Helen's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed their case with the thorough attention of someone who understood the gravity of making families official. Ms. Miller, Judge Morrison said, you've taken on the responsibility of raising 2 children who have experienced significant trauma and instability. Are you prepared for the challenges that may arise as they continue to heal and grow? Your Honor, Helen replied. These boys have already taught me more about resilience and love than I learned in 61 years of life before them. Whatever challenges come, we'll face them together. The judge turned to Marcus and Alex. And you two, are you certain that you want Ms. Miller to become your legal mother? This is a permanent decision that will affect the rest of your lives. Alex spoke. First, his voice clear and confident. Yes, ma'am. Helen has been our mom since the first night she took me home. We just want it to be official. Marcus nodded. Your Honor, Helen didn't just save us from a bad situation. She gave us a future. We want to be her sons, legally and in every other way that matters. Judge Morrison smiled then, the first break in her professional demeanor. In that case, it is my pleasure to finalize these adoption proceedings. Ms. Miller, you are now the legal mother of Marcus Rivera Miller and Alex Rivera Miller. Boys, congratulations. You have a forever family. As Helen signed the final documents, making Marcus and Alex legally her children, she felt a completeness she had never expected to experience again. When Sarah died, she had believed that her role as a mother was finished forever. But holding the adoption certificates that made Marcus and Alex her sons, she realized that love didn't follow the rules she had thought governed it. She could be Sarah's mother and Marcus and Alex's mother simultaneously. She could mourn her daughter while celebrating her sons. She could carry grief and joy in the same heart at the same time without diminishing either emotion. After the ceremony, they went to lunch at a small restaurant in town. The first time Helen had eaten in a public place in years. As she watched Marcus and Alex share a dessert and argue good-naturedly about which hiking trail they wanted to explore that weekend, Helen felt a sense of belonging that extended beyond their family, unit to the wider world they were now part of. Mom, Marcus said as they prepared to leave the restaurant, there's something Alex and I have been working on. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. We wanted to wait until the adoption was official to give this to you. Helen unwrapped the gift to find a framed drawing that took her breath away. Alex had sketched the three of them standing in front of their cabin, with Sarah's image lightly penciled in the sky above them like a guardian angel. At the bottom, in Marcus's careful handwriting, were the words, "The Miller family, chosen with love." Alex drew it, Marcus explained, but we both wanted you to know that we understand about Sarah. We're not trying to replace her or make you forget her. We just want to be part of your family alongside her memory. Helen felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the drawing. In Alex's artistic interpretation, she could see their past, present, and future woven together. Sarah's love, blessing their new family, the cabin that had sheltered them all, and the three of them standing together with the confidence of people who knew they belonged to each other. It's perfect, she managed to say. It's absolutely perfect. That evening, as they hung the new family portrait on the mantelpiece next to Sarah's photograph, Helen realized that her home had become something she had never imagined possible, a place where past love and present love coexisted, where grief and joy could share the same space, where a woman who had fled from family could discover that sometimes families were gifts that arrived when you most needed them and least expected them. Standing between her two sons in the warm light of their living room, Helen Miller was no longer a woman hiding from the world. She was a mother again, a guardian, a protector, and a believer in the power of love to heal wounds that had seemed permanent. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Helen looked toward the future with anticipation, instead of dread, knowing that whatever came next, she would face it with Marcus and Alex by her side. 1 year later, Helen stood at her kitchen window, watching Marcus teach Alex how to properly stack firewood, a scene that had become as natural and necessary as sunrise. The cabin that had once sheltered her solitude now hummed with the comfortable sounds of a family going about their daily routines. Alex practicing guitar chords on the instrument Helen had bought him for his 11th birthday. Marcus reading aloud from a college application essay he was working on, the radio playing softly in the background. The changes to her home reflected the transformation of their lives together. Marcus had built additional bookshelves to accommodate their growing library. Alex's artwork covered one wall of the living room, documenting everything from local wildlife to family portraits. Helen's old office had been converted into a study space where both boys did homework while she worked on her new project, a memoir about finding family in unexpected places. The desk where she wrote was positioned so she could see the mantelpiece, where 3 photographs now sat in harmony: Sarah's original portrait, the adoption day picture of all 3 of them at the courthouse, and a new family photo taken just last month. The newest picture showed them at the old depot, standing beside a memorial bench they had installed there with a small plaque reading, "In memory of all the lost children who found their way home." The depot memorial had been Alex's idea, born from his desire to honor the place where his family had truly begun. Every Christmas Eve, they returned there to leave fresh flowers and check on the small Christmas tree that local volunteers now maintained year-round. It had become a symbol of hope for other families facing separation and uncertainty. Helen's return to the world had been gradual but transformative. She had started by volunteering at the local school, helping students with college applications and career planning. Her counseling skills, refined by years of working with teenagers and deepened by her own experience with loss and recovery, made her a valuable resource for young people facing difficult decisions. Word of her work had spread, and she now served as an unofficial advocate for children aging out of foster care, connecting them with resources, helping them navigate the system, and occasionally opening her home to teenagers who needed short-term stability while they figured out their next steps. "Mom," Marcus called from outside, interrupting her thoughts. "Mrs. Chen is here." Helen smiled and went to greet the pharmacist, who had become a regular visitor and close friend. Mrs. Chen had been instrumental in connecting Helen with the network of social services that helped her advocate for vulnerable youth. "Helen," Mrs. Chen said warmly, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into what had become her usual chair by the fireplace. "I wanted to update you on the Johnson situation." They spent the next hour discussing the case of twins whose older sister was trying to gain custody, a situation that reminded Helen powerfully of Marcus and Alex's story, though with a happier trajectory from the start. "You've become quite the force for change in this county," Mrs. Chen observed as their meeting concluded. 10 years ago, no one would have predicted that the Hermit of Widow's Peak would become our most effective child advocate." Helen laughed at the description. "I prefer reformed hermit," she said, "and I had excellent teachers in the art of not giving up on family." As evening approached, their household settled into the rituals that had become precious to all of them. Marcus was preparing for his sophomore year at the State University, where he was studying journalism and social work. He commuted from home rather than living in a dormitory, a choice that reflected both financial practicality and his reluctance to be far from Alex and Helen. Alex, now 11 and thriving in middle school, had maintained his love of reading while developing new interests in music and environmental science. He had started a club at school focused on wildlife conservation and spent many of his free hours exploring the mountains around their home with the patient attention of a born naturalist. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing the events of their day, Marcus brought up a topic that had been on his mind for several weeks. "Mom, there's something I've been thinking about," he said, setting down his fork and looking at both Helen and Alex seriously. "Alex and I have been talking, and we have an idea we want to run by you." Helen felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. After more than a year of family life, she had learned to recognize the expression that meant her sons had been plotting something that would probably stretch her comfort zone in positive ways. "We want to start a program for siblings in foster care," Alex said, taking over the explanation with the enthusiasm that marked all his favorite projects. "Something that helps keep brothers and sisters together when they're moved between homes." Marcus nodded. "We've been researching and we found that siblings get separated in about 70% of foster placements. but kids who stay with their brothers and sisters have much better outcomes. Better grades, fewer behavioral problems, higher rates of successful adoption. Helen felt her heart swell with pride. What kind of program are you thinking about? We want to create a resource center, Marcus explained. Somewhere that advocates specifically for sibling groups, provides support for families willing to take multiple children, and offers emergency placement services when regular foster homes can't accommodate siblings together. Alex leaned forward eagerly. And we want to call it the Depot Project. You know, like a place where people wait for family to come back for them. Helen sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of their vision and the maturity it represented. That's a beautiful idea, she said finally, and a huge undertaking. How would we fund something like that? Well, Marcus said with a grin, that reminded Helen of Alex's expression when he had something particularly exciting to share. We've already started. I've been writing grant applications as part of my journalism program, and Alex designed a presentation that we've been giving to community groups. Alex jumped up and ran to get a folder from the living room. We've raised almost $15,000 already, and the county says if we can show community support and a solid business plan, they'll consider giving us office space in the municipal building. Helen looked at the detailed plans her sons had developed, budget projections, program timelines, partnership agreements with local social services, and realized that Marcus and Alex had inherited more than survival skills from their difficult early years. They had also developed empathy, determination, and a deep understanding of what vulnerable children needed most. There's one more thing, Marcus said quietly. We want you to be the director. Alex and I can be youth consultants and help with outreach, but we need an adult with experience in counseling and child advocacy to make it legitimate. Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she understood what they were really asking. They weren't just proposing a community service project, they were inviting her to transform her newfound purpose into a lasting legacy, to use everything she had, learned from losing Sarah and finding them to help other families stay together. Are you sure you want your mother running your project? She asked with a laugh that was half joy and half overwhelm. Mom, Alex said with the earnest intensity that made him seem far older than 11. You saved our family. Now we want to help you save other families too. Besides, Marcus added with his characteristic dry humor, who better to run a program for keeping families together than someone who adopted 2 kids she found at the side of the road? 3 months later, Helen stood in the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Depot Project's new offices, surrounded by county officials, community volunteers, and the first families they had successfully kept together. Marcus and Alex flanked her as she cut the red ribbon, both wearing matching T-shirts Alex had designed with the project logo, a stylized tree decorated with lights, reminiscent of the makeshift Christmas tree where their story had begun. In the crowd, Helen spotted familiar faces. Sheriff Martinez, who had become a strong supporter of their work, Mrs. Chen, who served on their advisory board, Judge Morrison, who had streamlined court procedures to prioritize sibling placements, and dozens of other community members who had rallied around their mission. As the ceremony concluded and people began touring their new facilities, Helen found herself standing in front of a display case that told the story of the Depot Project's founding. The centerpiece was Alex's original drawing of their family, surrounded by photographs documenting their journey from that first Christmas Eve to this celebration of their expanded mission. Pretty amazing what started with one scared kid and a stubborn woman, Marcus said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of punch from the reception table, and one determined big brother who was willing to risk everything to protect the person he loved most, Helen added, accepting the punch and smiling at her son. Alex joined them, slightly out of breath from giving tours to interested visitors. Mom, there's a family here from Denver who drove 3 hours just to learn about our program. They're trying to adopt a sibling group of 3 kids, and their social worker told them we might be able to help. Helen felt the familiar surge of Purpose that had become her greatest source of joy, the knowledge that their story of found family was helping other families form and survive. As the afternoon wound down and the last visitors departed, Helen stood in the quiet offices of the Depot Project with Marcus and Alex, looking at the intake forms, resource lists, and family photographs that would soon fill the space with the business of keeping families together. "I have something for you both," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver frame containing the original note Alex had left for Marcus on the Christmas tree at the depot, carefully preserved, and mounted beside a new photograph of the memorial bench they had installed there. "I wanted you to have this," Helen said, "as a reminder of how far we've come and why this work matters." Alex read his own childish handwriting aloud. "Dear Marcus, I am staying with a nice lady named Helen who lives in the mountains. She has a warm house and food. I will check the tree every day until you come. I didn't give up on you. Love, Alex." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "That note kept me going through the worst days of my captivity. Knowing Alex was safe and being cared for by someone kind, it made everything bearable. And now," Helen said, looking around at the offices that would serve as headquarters for their mission to keep other siblings together, "that note is helping us make sure other children don't have to be as scared and alone as you both were." As they locked up the offices and headed home to their cabin on Widow's Peak, Helen realized that her journey from isolation to family to community advocate had brought her full circle in ways she never could have imagined. She had fled to the mountains to escape the pain of losing a child, only to discover that her capacity for love hadn't died with Sarah. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to grow in new directions. That night, as she tucked the adoption certificates and Depot Project Incorporation papers into the same file folder, Helen reflected on the unpredictable ways that love could transform loss into purpose, fear into courage, and strangers into family. Outside her window, the stars that had once seemed cold and distant now looked like pinpricks of hope in the darkness, reminders that even in the deepest night, there was light to guide people home to the places and people where they belonged. Helen Miller was no longer a woman hiding from the world. She was a mother, an advocate, and a believer in the power of love to create families in the most unexpected places. And as she turned off the lights in her home, where 3 beds would soon hold 3 people who had chosen each other across all the odds against them, she knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that sometimes the most important families are the ones you build yourself, one act of faith at a time. The new family photo on the mantelpiece caught the last rays of moonlight streaming through the window. Helen, Marcus, and Alex standing together in front of the Depot Project offices, with Sarah's gentle presence blessing them from the corner of the frame where Alex had drawn her, watching over their work. It was a portrait of love that transcended loss, of family that defied conventional definitions, and of hope that persisted even in the darkest moments. And in the quiet of that mountain cabin where it all began, that was more than enough.